tell you. I was born in Vancouver, Canada, and my name was Judith Sachko Ono, and I came to the United States in 1968. I took out my citizenship in the United States 2 years ago after 30 years of residing in the United States. I was 2 years old when we were sent to camp in February of 1942. And as a child, my sister, who was 7, and I thought that the camp experience was a fun time. My mother, born in Canada in 1910, was very bitter until the day she died in 1971. My dad was killed in a logging accident when I was a year old, so it was a year after that we went to camp. My mother had 2 small children and elderly parents to care for during this very stressful time. My grandparents were born in Japan and came to Canada in the late 1800s. Grandfather died in 1948 in Winnipeg, and if you know anything about Canadian geography, Winnipeg is in the center of Canada. He was 86 years old. We were very close. I spoke no Japanese. He spoke a little English, but we could communicate. Even prior to the war, there was a great deal of racial tension in Canada. Most of the Japanese Canadians were concentrated on the west coast around Vancouver, and they were viewed as a threat to the field of employment in fishing, farming, and logging. The occurrence of the incarceration of Japanese Americans gave the Canadian government license to do the same in Canada. They had always wanted to rid the west coast of Japanese aliens. We were described as a menace to the safety of Canada. For 3 months, from December of 41, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, to the end of February, all the boats belonging to the Japanese fishermen were confiscated. The newspapers and churches were closed, the language schools were closed, and the males in leadership positions, the Japanese Canadian males in leadership positions, were put into jail. There was a partial evacuation. This is where we differ a little bit from what happened to the Americans. There was a partial evacuation in the middle of January of men 18 to 45 years old. So families were separated and they were put into labor camps. The men were sent to work on road crews, sugar beet farms in other provinces, and logging camps. If they resisted or refused to go, they were incarcerated, and then they were sent to a camp in northeastern Ontario, which is east of Manitoba. And there they stayed in camp with German prisoners of war that were captured in the European theater. Less than 2 weeks later, in February 1942, a complete evacuation was ordered of all Canadians, and this was through an Order in Council, number 1486, ordering all Japanese Canadians to be moved, prohibited from entering, leaving, or returning to areas, restricted employment, or to do business or communicate with others. They were prohibited from having cameras, radios, and guns. And my mother remembers seeing the neighbors standing on the banks of the Fraser River, throwing in their cameras and radios rather than turn them into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. There was a dusk to dawn curfew, and so no Japanese Canadians were allowed out on the street, and that proved to be quite a hardship, especially during emergencies. Some had as little as 2 hours to collect their possessions, and that was limited to what they could carry. We were told that everything was going to be taken care of by the government, so don't worry about leaving anything. And we were told that we could come back soon. In 1943, after we were in camp a year, we found out that all our possessions had been auctioned off by the government, and our real estate had been sold to returning veterans from the war. Very little of the money came to the people in camp. We were charged for the auctioneer's fees, we were charged for transportation, we were charged for the work of the custodian of enemy property. I learned, when the Canadian government followed the American government and paid redress to us, I learned in the apology that the monies collected from the sale of real estate was used to support us in camp. On a personal note, my grandfather was like all pioneers. He worked very hard to acquire possessions, to carve a place for his family in this new land. He was fairly successful. He owned several boarding houses in downtown Vancouver. He owned a seed farm, and he owned an orchard. It was a very hard and frugal life. When his holdings were sold, we were living in Winnipeg. And the money came in 1950. It was $5,000. My mother said she was so glad that my grandfather wasn't alive to see what his struggles had been worth. Her sisters, who lived in Ontario, thought that grandfather's property was worth at least $25,000. And so they accused her of taking the rest of the money. She never spoke to them again. All Japanese Canadians were rounded up when they lived outside of Vancouver and put into Hastings Park. Hastings Park was in the center of Vancouver and was very much like your county fairgrounds here in California. They were given horse stalls to live in, much like the Santa Ana racetracks here in the United States. And the only privacy that they got was by stringing blankets over the openings. It was communal dining like you saw in the film. And no matter how much they cleaned and whitewashed the stalls, it still had an animal stench to it. From February to October, that's 8 months, 21,000 Japanese Canadians went through Hastings Park. Now, it's quite a difference in terms of ratio because in America, you heard that there was 120,000 Japanese Americans. In Canada, there was only about 24,000 Japanese Canadians. In 9 days, almost 1,500 Japanese Canadians were rounded up, and at the height of the evacuation, 4,000 lived in Hastings Park. Women, children, and elderly disabled men were what was left to go and relocate in the ghost towns in interior British Columbia. The internment camps were called relocation centers and were east of the Rockies in places like Kaslo, New Denver, Greenwood, Lemon Creek, Slocan, and Sandon. Families who wanted to stay together, that is, they wanted to keep father there and husband there, had to relocate east, and they could relocate in Alberta. I hope you know your Canadian geography. In Alberta and in Manitoba. They were sent to sugar beet farms. Labor was very short in those provinces, and the work on the sugar beet farms was very, very difficult. So farmers wanted the Japanese labor, and even little children worked in the fields. The farmers did not have accommodations, so many of these people had to stay in chicken coops. There was no running water, and they had to boil water out of the ditches. They were not used to the harsh, harsh weather of the Canadian prairies. They lived in the temperate coastal zone like we enjoy here. The conditions in the ghost towns were also severe because they were up in the mountains of British Columbia. Many of us started out in tents with snow in the ground. Shacks were built as soon as we got there, and they were built out of green wood, so when the green wood dried, it shrunk, and there was these great big gaps between the timbers, and so the snow and the wind would blow in. We froze. The shacks were 3 rooms. They were 14 by 24 feet. There was a room in the center that had a stove and a sink. There was one family of 6 on one side and one family of 6 on the other. So the quarters were very, very crowded. School started approximately after a year that we were in camp, and what they did was the churches rounded up young Japanese ladies who were given a few classes in teaching, and that was our educators for camp. The British Columbia Securities Commission, which was in charge of maintaining alien enemies, wanted us to move out of camp and settle east of the Rockies. But the people in camp were very, very frightened because there were newspaper reports and radio reports that there were demonstrations in cities saying that they did not want the Japanese to resettle in their communities. In 1945, that was the end of the war, all the Japanese still in camp were given two choices. They could relocate east, they could not go back to the coast, or they could be deported to Japan. So you see there's a difference here with the American experience. About 20% decided to go back to Japan. Of these 20%, there were about 4,000. 50% of those were young children under the age of 16 who were born in Canada and considered Japan a foreign country. They did not want to go. The government wanted to encourage as many Japanese Canadians to go to Japan as possible, and so they offered $200 an adult and $75 a child. A delegation of 5 leaders was sent to Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, to fight against the deportation, disenfranchisement, legal discrimination, and loss of property. And one of those 5 was a man named S.I. Hayakawa. Now, some of you might recognize that as a former senator for the state of California. No legal recourse was available. It was taken as far as the Privy Council of Great Britain. Remember that Canada was part of the Commonwealth, and so everything went to Great Britain as the last legal fight. They ruled that it was legal under the War Measures Act. Camps were finally closed in 1948. The war finished in 45, so we were in camp 3 years after the war finished. The legacy of our experience in camp is very difficult to evaluate. Japanese Canadians have always wanted to assimilate. And there's stories of Japanese farmers meeting their picture brides and wanting them immediately to get into Western clothes so that they would be seen as part of the Canadian population. And after the war, there became a need to become more Canadian than the rest of the Canadian population. And that was fueled by shame and a need to be as invisible as possible. Our Nisei parents instilled in us and tried to maintain some prevailing values that they held very dear. Those values were ones of reserve, restraint, patience, perseverance, and fatalistic resignation. The psychological trauma inflicted by forced deportation to the camps in the foreign country of Japan, loss of property, and forced dispersal eastward created very passive people. And people wonder why we didn't do more at that time. But all that trauma made us want to assimilate more and not stand out at all. So effective was the teachings of my mother that in my youth, when I went and looked in a mirror, I was surprised to see that I was Japanese. Redress was won in Canada for Japanese Canadians shortly after the success of the Americans. We got $21,000, that was $16,000 US at that time, and an apology for everybody interned in camp. For those like myself, I didn't have bitterness about the experience, that was all right. But for those like my mother and my grandparents, who had a great deal of anger and bitterness, I'm glad that she wasn't alive to see what had come to pass. I have two children, Jonathan, 27, and Tricia, 23. They're of mixed racial heritage. They are very, very proud of their Japanese ham. And I think that it is so wonderful not to be ashamed, not to have to hide, and have confidence in your own identity. In 1992, my sister and I went to a reunion of the relocation in Vancouver. And we took a tour of all the camps, and we saw a memorial of a shack that had been rebuilt. We discovered a picture in the museum in Castle of all these little kids, and there was myself and my sister. It was quite a discovery. But most of all, I found a need to become more informed of the deeds committed by governments in the guise of national security, to promote and commit acts, the basis of which lay in racial hatred and fear. We must do our best to educate our youth, that's you guys out there, to recognize these things so that we can always be vigilant and be sure that we speak up if it were ever to happen again. Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes. Konnichiwa. Good afternoon. I always like to start my talk with the greetings in the languages that represent my cultural background. My name is Lydia Nao Yamamoto. I was born as Lydia Hideko Maoki. I'm very privileged to share this little-known story of the deportation and incarceration of Japanese Peruvians and Japanese Latin Americans during World War II. This is not only a story, it's history. History of World War II, history of American Japanese, history of the whole world, as a matter of fact, because it involves so many countries. I'd like to start with a little bit of background so that you have an idea as to why Japanese Latin Americans were incarcerated. First of all, you wonder, how did the Japanese get to Peru in the first place? Well, in 1869, Japanese started to emigrate to the United States. And when the doors were closed, the Japanese started to look for other places to go because they did want to start a new life. Japan was in so-called depression. Well, Peru was one of the countries that needed workers. And so Japan authorized the emigration of Japanese to Peru. And the first Japanese went to Peru in 1899. And most of them went as contract laborers in agriculture, mining, and beginning industry. And by 1940, there were about 26,000 persons of Japanese ancestry in Peru. About 17,600 were Issei. That's first generation of people that went to Peru. And they represented about 28.9% of the foreign population in Peru. There were about 8,800 Niseis, or children born of the Isseis. From the beginning, there was tension due to job competition and wage differentials, and also communication difficulties because of the language differences. During World War I, the Peruvian government began taking anti-Japanese measures by restricting immigration and concerns about Japanese land ownership. And during 1930s, leading to World War II, many Japanese actually left Peru and returned to Japan due to the economic depression and mounting hostile legislation. In 1937, due to Japanese expansion in the Far East and invasion of China, an anti-Japanese campaign was waged in the press which reflected concerns of economic competition, fear of military threat, and racism. In May 1940, there was a big anti-Japanese riot in Lima, in Callao, Lima, which is the capital city, some of you may know. And Callao is a nearby port, where about 600 businesses and private homes and farms and schools were damaged seriously and looted. Excuse me. You are familiar with what happened on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor. Immediately following, the Japanese American were rounded up and taken to relocation camps. You have heard how the Canadian Japanese were treated. For us in Peru, the Peruvian government froze bank accounts the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor and placed other restrictions on the Japanese community. Then the US government began to blacklist Japanese individuals and businesses in Latin America. About a week later, persons of Japanese ancestry began to be apprehended and deported to the Panama Canal Zone for internment under the auspices of the US government. Actually, when Japan attacked China in 1937, as early as 1937, the US government began to think about what they could do in case the US citizens were held overseas in the Far East, in the war zones. And they even contemplating sending some of the Japanese Americans to Japan in exchange for US prisoners held by Japan. But they thought that would be too precocious, too dangerous, international relations. And so they looked to the Latin American countries, to the backyard, more or less. And so before December 7, 1941, between August and October, the US government met with the Panamanian government and discussed this matter and came to an agreement that as soon as Japan and the United States entered into war, the Japanese living in Panama would be rounded and incarcerated. And so these plans were already in line. So as soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Panamanian government took all the Japanese living in Panama and placed them into an internment camp. In the meantime, after that, the US government met with the Latin American countries and tried to have hostages brought by the Latin American countries so that they could use the Japanese Latin Americans as hostages to exchange prisoners with US citizens held overseas. Only 13 countries went along with it. Peru was one of them. Of course, Peru is right on the Pacific Ocean, on the Pacific side of the continent, so it was very welcome that Peru would go along with this agreement. And so before the Pearl Harbor attack, already the FBI had been working on getting a blacklist ready so that they knew exactly who to pick up as soon as the war started. And many of our principals, newspaper editors, teachers, priests, they were the very first ones to be apprehended. When our principal left our school, we didn't know where he had gone. We had no idea where he and his family were taken. Well, in January 6th, on the night of January 6, 1943, the policemen came to our home and took my father into prison with no explanation. My father had come in 1914 on a contract, 3-year contract, and worked, and after his 3 years were over, he went searching for a place to settle. And he decided that the northern part of Peru was better for him. And so he settled in a small city called Chiclayo, about 400 miles north of Lima. There he started a small coffee shop, actually not in the city of Chiclayo, but about 15 miles outside of Chiclayo in a plantation, sugar plantation. And there, I guess the plantation was like a little village. It housed quite a few people, close to 1,000, I believe. And there he had a little cafe. He started the business as a little cafe and then later expanded. But by the time that he was taken in 1943, he had a business in the city of Chiclayo, a bakery making bread, and he also had a tire repair shop, and on the side he was having my relative, my aunt, make noodles, and we, my mother and the help tended to the store that was the cafe. It turned to a store, and so he was very busy, he was very enterprising. And he was very active in the Japanese society, Japan Society they called it, and built Japanese private school in the city of Chiclayo. So when he was taken in, on January 6th, we, the children, my sister and I, the older ones, were going to school in the city of Chiclayo, and he had been in the hacienda. And so I had no idea at all until the next morning when about 20 fathers, my friends' fathers, were gathered in a corner, and we all gathered there to say goodbye. And we didn't know where they were being taken. And my father was very close to me, and so I asked my mother, "Where's he going?" And she said, "We don't know." When is he coming back? We don't know. So to me, it was a real traumatic time because I thought I was going to lose my dad. Excuse me. We saw the men get into the truck and drive away. It wasn't until a month later that we heard from him. He had written a very brief note in time for my sister's birthday. He had sent a little pressed flower and just said that he was okay. He was all right, and he was in Panama. I'm sure the letter was censored because he did not write very much, but we were glad to hear from him because we finally found out that he was okay. We didn't know until then where he was or how he was. The men that were in Panama were put into a military camp, and I should go back a little ways. They were put on a boat for a ship and guarded by military, U.S. military personnel with guns, and they were, wherever they went on the ship, they were being followed by soldiers with guns with bayonet. So they were very fearful. But in Panama, they were made to do hard labor. One man was saying he was digging ditches. He thought he was digging his own grave. But there were a lot of men who were not young. My dad was in his mid-40s, not old, but he was not used to doing digging work. And after that, the men were put on a ship and taken to San Pedro, where they boarded a train and went to Texas. My father was interned in Kennedy, Texas. These camps that we were in were not World War relocation camps, WRA camps. Ours were immigration camps. It was the Department of Justice camps run by the U.S. INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. So he and all these men that were put into Kennedy, Texas, were waiting to be returned shortly, but they found out at that time that they were going to be sent to Japan as exchange prisoners. Until then, they had no idea. Well, they thought that, or they knew that this was in violation of the Geneva Convention, and so they protested. Through the Spanish embassy, they protested to the Peruvian government. And the United States sought this to be a very good opportunity to get more hostages so that they could exchange more U.S. citizens held by Japan. And so then the families were given orders to join the fathers. And of course, our fathers did not want to leave the family behind because of the riots that they had in 1940, and also because of all the only people left would be the mothers and the children. And so they asked to see if they could be united. Well, being united meant that we had to go into camp also. And so in July of 1943, we left Peru, boarded a ship, and made our way through Panama. I remember I was 7.5 at the time that I left Peru. I remember going into Panama, a canal area, and they told us that we all had to go into our cabins. And so we all piled into our cabins, and all the kids ran to the porthole to look out to see what was happening. And before we knew it, the porthole was closed on us. We were not allowed to see what was going on the outside. But the voyage on the ship was fun for us children. For our mothers, they were very concerned. They didn't know what was going to happen. When we arrived in New Orleans, I remember that many of our properties, the things that we had brought with us, were confiscated. And we stayed in New Orleans for a couple of days, and then we were put on a train towards San Antonio. And there we boarded a bus and were sent to Crystal City, Texas. Crystal City, Texas, the camp was considered one of the model camps, and it was a way for the United States to show other countries' representatives that they were treating their prisoners well and hoping that it would be reciprocated. The camp was not only occupied by us Peruvian Japanese, but there were Japanese Americans that had been sent there from other camps, and there were some Germans and a few Italians. So it was quite international. In camp, we had to go to Japanese school. I spoke very little Japanese because in Peru we spoke nothing but Spanish. And my sister, who's 5 years older, was going to Japanese school, and she spoke Japanese and read and wrote Japanese, but not I, because I started my school years after the war had started. So we went to Japanese school to learn the etiquette and the language so that when we were sent to Japan, we would not be completely lost. Between 1942 and 1943, there were 2 shiploads of people sent to Japan in exchange. The Gripsum ship was sent twice. But after that, I understand that the Japanese government didn't want any more prisoner exchange, so the United States kept us in camp, although they kept on bringing in people from Peru and a couple of other countries. The last one coming in 1945, just before the war ended. Well, when the war ended in 1945, the government said to us, "You'll have to leave the country. You're illegal aliens." It was the United States that confiscated our passports or would not give us visas. They were the ones that took us out of our country and put us incarcerated in camp. But we were illegal aliens, and so we had to find our way out. The Peruvian government refused to take us back. And so without any alternative, over 900 Japanese Peruvians left the camp and went to Japan. to war-devastated country. I had a sister who had a family with little children. They went. And we were to go too, but the day before we were to leave, my father became very ill, and so they would not take us on board the ship, and we remained in camp. My sister in Japan would write to us how difficult things were, how difficult it was to get food, and many times they would have to go out in the field and dig up weeds in order to fill their stomach. I felt very, very fortunate that my father became ill, because listening to the letters that she wrote, I thought, oh, we would have been really in bad shape, because my father was not well, no telling what could have happened to him. Well, there were about 360 Peruvian Japanese that remained in camp. And in 1946, the government offered some people to go out and work in a food processing plant in New Jersey. Apparently this company had offered to sponsor some Japanese Peruvians, and if they would work for them. And so a little over 100 of them left camp and went to work in New Jersey. And the rest of us remained, trying to find out how we can stay here in the United States. And then the government said that if you found a sponsor, you may leave the camp. And so I had an aunt in Berkeley who became one of the sponsors. We had to have 3. And my aunt and her daughter and a friend became our sponsor, and we finally left camp in May of 1947. We were there 4 years, almost 4 years, and we came out to Berkeley on the train. The fare which my father had saved was all he had, was a fare to Berkeley. And there we would have a new start. We didn't know English, so we had to learn English. And I remember being put in the 6th grade, because I was 12. They put me in the 6th grade, and the kids who were my classmates just loved the way I spoke English, because I had a real cute accent. But it was very difficult for my parents. They never spoke anything about camp or war in front of us children. But I know later on, too, my mother would tell us how difficult it was for them. It was very hard for my father, because he had done a great deal of work in business, and his health was not good. And so whatever he did, it didn't agree with him. He worked for a laundry, and that wasn't good for him. And so he finally had to work as a janitor, and became a very good janitor. He was always recommended by his employers. And so he was never without a job. In that respect, he really worked with a lot of integrity, self-esteem. And that's one of the things that he taught me. No matter what you do, have self-esteem, integrity, and do your very best, because it'll be acknowledged someday. But so we did. We started anew in Berkeley and learned English. And I still have an accent. It's not quite as heavy as it used to be, but I'm still maintaining my Japanese and trying to maintain my Spanish, so that I can converse with more people from different parts of the world. And it is really interesting when you are able to communicate with different parts of the people of different countries. I really appreciate this time that you gave me to share my story. And one of the reasons why I like to tell our story too is not only because of the hardship, not only because of what happened to us Japanese Americans, Japanese Latin Americans, but because we don't want these things to happen again. And as Judith mentioned, if any ethnic people are in danger of being incarcerated, I hope you people will speak up. This is an example was some time ago when the Iran was in conflict. The United States government sent FBI's interrogating Iranians. These were American citizens, but they were interrogating. They were all ready to put them into an internment camp. They had camps ready, and members of the Japanese Americans citizenshly spoke out and prevented the internment of these Iranian Americans. So I hope you do the same, that if any time in the future anything should happen, you will speak out. Thank you so very much.